Hey, everybody. It is June 21st, 2020, Father's Day 2020. Um, let's go ahead and start things off just by raising a toast to all the fathers out there, as well as the people who fortunately have lost their father, like myself. I lost my dad 8 years ago. So, Father's Day is always a little bit of a mixed bag. Happy to celebrate other people's fathers and the memory of my own father. Here's to people who don't necessarily talk to their fathers anymore, or for the single parents out there who have to, be both parents for everybody. Here's cheers to that. All right, everybody. It is a balmy night in southeastern Georgia. We are in the thick of summer, and the insects are going strong. The humidity is going strong. Um, Yeah, what a night to sit down, drink some bourbon, answer some questions. Before we get started, I'll go ahead and weave in the questions that I've got. And if you have more questions, feel free to add them into the chat. I'll get to them as I can. We've got a pretty full load, but do what we can. I mean, what else am I doing, right? Sunday night. The question that a lot of people are asking is about Trump's embarrassing rally last night, and what to make of it, and how to feel about it, and what it all means. I'll say first of all that I was just relieved that it didn't turn into a tragedy. I mean, obviously we have a lot of Trump supporters who exposed themselves to coronavirus and are going to carry coronavirus to their families and their communities, and that is its own tragedy. I went on the Slate's Trump cast this week and talked to Virginia Heffernan about the possibility that this might be a cathartic moment for Trump supporters to get a lot of their anger out. And as a lot of you probably know, I covered Trump rallies in 2016 and saw a lot of violence and heard a lot of comments that were really problematic and troubling. So there was a concern that I had, and I think a lot of other people who have covered these things have had, that it could have gotten really bad last night, particularly considering that Trump is obviously losing in his quest for reelection, but also losing the cultural narrative in terms of Black Lives Matter, and momentum is completely against him. And there was a lot of concern that if some protesters showed up either in the rally or outside the rally, that it could potentially lead to violence. God knows I've seen my fair share of violence in Trump rallies and outside of Trump rallies. I think what saved it last night was the fact that Trump was just really, really terrible, and not as usual kind of terrible. Because I mean, obviously he's disgusting and you know just a complete moron. But it was such a low energy rally from him. I mean, at one point, he talked about being able to drink water and walk down ramps, and he talked about it for God, like 30 minutes. And, one of the most pathetic but also metaphorical things, and this is what I'm going to write about tomorrow on the muckrake. He drank from a glass of water, and that led to cheers of 4 more years, which is just, it's as sad as it gets, really, in the definition of white supremacy in America. So I'll be writing about that tomorrow in the muckrake. But I think it was Trump's really terrible performance and really pathetic performance, I think, that actually brought the level down. When I was at Trump rallies in 2016, he would do these big rambling things, and eventually, what you would see is people away from the scrum, and the scrum is the group right by the stage. They're there to get rowdy. It's a mosh pit like situation. These are true believers. These are people who support Trump no matter what, and they want to get violent, and a lot of them are fascistic. The people on the outskirts would eventually reach this point with Trump where they would just start turning to each other and they would say, "What in the hell is he talking about? What's going on here?" And they would get bored and they would just start leaving for the exits, which is a really weird thing to watch at these rallies. And it's not something that TV really conveys. So I think his performance last night definitely brought the energy down. And usually, whenever he has like a really fiery rally, and I saw my fair share of those, people would leave his rallies ready for violence. And, they would leave and they would confront protesters wherever they found them, and they would escalate these tensions with them. And I think last night everyone sort of left and were just bummed out of their minds. And I think we're very lucky that that happened. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case through 2012 or through 2020. I think we're going to see some really messed up situations, unfortunately, and we'll get to those when we get to them. But let's get to some of the questions. Zach asked, "It seems like Trump is a sinking ship. Who or what will signal it's really over for him?" He's absolutely a sinking ship. I mean, I don't want to get too dramatic 5 minutes into the live stream, but I mean, this is like a Führer bunker situation, man. It's bleak. I mean, he has no actual momentum whatsoever. His campaign, I mean, if you watched it last night, there was no message. I mean, the thing that he promised people, I mean, it's the usual, I'll fight for you or whatever, but his biggest promise and accomplishment that he talked about, besides drinking water, was haggling over the price of Air Force One. It was really bizarre. There's no narrative for this thing. And on top of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about this too, um, he doesn't even have like the hatred that his crowds used to have for Hillary Clinton. Obviously he's facing off against a white man, and Joe Biden has not been attacked by conspiracy theories for 30 years by, fever dreamed conservatives. So they don't even have that. He would mention Joe Biden and it would just sort of be like this murmur. And it's really obvious that this is a campaign without a rudder. That doesn't mean he's going to lose, of course. And we'll talk a little bit later on about the Electoral College and the problem there. But he has a natural advantage, which is that the people who support him are in states that are advantaged by holdovers from the founding of America that advantaged slaveholding states. And so, that naturally advantages them. It's one of the reasons we need to get rid of the Electoral College. So he has a chance. I mean, he could win, and God knows where this thing's going to go. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Um, Now that he's losing, and there's a possibility, and you got to remember, losing the presidency isn't the worst thing that could happen to Donald Trump. I mean, he hates this job. The only thing that's good about it is that he is at the nexus of American attention, and everybody has to pay attention to him. And, he's basically jacked into, our collective unconscious. He doesn't want the job. He doesn't enjoy the actual job. He doesn't actually want to do the job. He just wants to dismantle American government, which, great. Congrats. But the worst thing for him is being humiliated, being swept out of office, being one of the few modern presidents who only serves one term and loses reelection. We saw last night that, the fascistic calls to action and the paranoid ramblings, they're just going to get worse. And as his supporters start to understand that they might lose power, they're going to get worse too. This is what happens with a fascistic movement: is the more that they perceive that they're losing power, the more dangerous and desperate that they get. So, what'll signal it's over for him? Losing the election and it being a situation where he can't contest it, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But, these are people who are not just delusional, but their delusions are so fortified by a lifetime of delusion and privilege that it doesn't end until it ends, and that's the unfortunate truth. Somebody asked, is the Trump movement dying? The rally in Tulsa was such a disappointment, and Trump's losing badly in every poll. What do you think he'll do next? Will he accept defeat? What happens to Trump if he's defeated? I don't think Trump can accept defeat. For those of you who have read some of my writing, you know that Trump really has no religion besides the power of positive thinking, which is, the prosperity gospel. And it's this idea that a lot of corporate people and wealthy people hold to, which is you have to be relentlessly and delusionally positive, and that's the only way to sort of control yourself in the world. He cannot imagine a world where he actually loses an election. Although you might have noticed if you watched the rally last night that he actually mentioned a lot of times the possibility of losing, which he didn't really do in 2016. He mentioned the idea that it could be rigged against him or whatever, but last night it was obvious that it was on his mind. He mentioned it multiple times. You got to get out and vote. You got to do this, and possibly we could lose at the polls. And he said this weird thing where he's like, unless Americans do something stupid on election day, he's breaking. He's breaking. And if any of you have ever known like a really toxic individual you can tell when they're insecure. It's when they boast. It's when they talk about themselves and they build themselves up and they puff out their chest. It's really pathetic. And Trump did that last night. I mean, he talked about his money. He talked about how handsome he was. It was just this really bizarre performance. And it was sad. It was really, really sad. So, no, I don't think he will accept defeat. I mean, the question actually beaten. I think we could have a constitutional crisis. But if you want to gain some hope, the hope you can gain is the fact that the military stood against him whenever he tried his authoritarian stunt during the protest. And, the possibility they might, throw him out on his ass and that might be it. Trumpism is not going to go away with Trump. It doesn't matter what happens with the election. It doesn't matter if he passes away. It doesn't matter if he, is revealed to be treasonous, as he already has. Trumpism is not about Trump. It's something much larger and more American and weird and fascistic. There's going to be people for years and years and years who still talk about Trump and being loyal to him. And what we need to understand is that this was here before him. It's only that he brought it out into the daylight and normalized it and completed the takeover of the Republican Party, which flirted with what you would call Trumpism for years and years and years. Unfortunately, and again, I'm trying to be more hopeful recently because I think there's more hope, but unfortunately, and this is something we need to understand, is that what Trump has done in a lot of ways has been by instinct. The way that he's acted toward the press and towards our politics and the way he's conducted himself have been more about his instincts. I say it on the Muckrake podcast all the time. He's like the velociraptor in Jurassic Park. And it's just like he's flailing against the fence and trying to find its weaknesses, and eventually he finds them, right? There are a lot of people, and I'm talking about fascists, I'm talking about far-right authoritarians, who are studying the ways that Trump has found the weaknesses in the fence, and they're reverse engineering them. They're figuring out how they can be the next Trump, how they can take the cult of Trumpism and sort of like use it for their own purposes. And the really scary thing is that Trump doesn't really have an ideology. The only thing he does is he destroys government simply because he wants more profit and more power, and he wants the ability to be as corrupt as he wants to be without government interfering. There are other people who have a strict ideology, and they are a lot more, they have a lot more structure than Trump. They have a lot more ability to do things and stay on message. And Trump's his own worst enemy. I mean, he's completely self-destructive. So there's a real possibility that after Trump, Trumpism not only continues, but thrives. And one of the things that we have to talk about is how that might not happen and what we can do to get rid of it. But no, I don't think he'll accept defeat. He might just turn into this weird rambling ex-president who has his own Trump network or OAN or whatever. And whenever I think about it, I just imagine him having like an Oval Office, like TV set where like he gives an alternate presidency, to his followers. I could totally see that happening. I mean, it's really sad and weird, but I could see that happening. Andrew, say Trump loses and does actually leave office. What happens to his followers? I feel like this ideology will find new outer shells like a hermit crab. Will we see a worse Trump? Will they give up on the democratic system? Will some of them accept defeat and yield? That depends. There is a thing when you look at Trumpism and you look at what he's done. And again, I say this all the time. Trump is a symptom. He's not the disease. The people who support him have been the people who would support him most of their lives. A lot of them have been radicalized simply because, they have their own shit going on. Will they find somebody else? I don't know. One of my hopes, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more with a question later on. One of my hopes is that maybe they could be brought back into the fold and the fever will go down. And maybe, when you don't have someone who's stoking this stuff for his own advantages, maybe they'll calm down a little bit, or maybe they won't become as organized, or they won't become radicalized. It does not mean that they'll be cured or they'll be, purified of whatever Trumpism is, because unfortunately, Trumpism and fascism and authoritarianism are just human conditions. They're everywhere all the time, and they're always waiting on a catalyst to find power or to be radicalized or become dangerous. So I think they're always going to be there. How society works and whether or not it gives them oxygen, that's a different conversation, right? I mean, that's a That's a different thing that we have to look at. We have to look at how we treat them, how we communicate with them, and we have to look at how our culture works as a whole, which is like one of the bigger, more vexing problems of all of this. Yvette asks, what should might happen if Trump steals the election? Republicans are desperate to remain in power. What recourse will we have if there are massive voting irregularities? I want to be positive, but I have to answer this question by being real. There are going to be voting irregularities. American voting has not been free or fair for a very long time. And it won't be free and fair as long as the Republican Party cannot win free and fair elections. It's one of the reasons it's a fascistic movement. They don't have the numbers anymore. They're a white identity group that is more and more selective and isolated. And so as a result, you're not going to have free and fair elections. You're going to have gerrymandering. You're going to have voting irregularities. What happens if he steals the election? I think the Black Lives Matter protest movement has shown us that there is energy, kinetic potential energy in America for an uprising or a protest movement against tyranny. Obviously, a lot of this is about George Floyd. A lot of this is about the, illegal murders of Black people by law enforcement. But there's a lot more going on here. I mean, I don't think that these protests would necessarily have the energy or the mass that they do if America wasn't basically a failed state at the moment, and not handling just the coronavirus, but also the economic collapse. So yeah, that's the question. What would happen? I would have to assume that we would be in the streets and we wouldn't leave until something occurred. The alternative of that we just sort of wake up the next day and we accept it, or that we lose rising against that, that's a terrifying idea, because if we lose the ability to have free and fair elections completely, there's really no coming back from that thing. Trump is sort of the last opportunity that we have to secure something approaching human government and something approaching a democratic, fair, equal system. And if we fail in that, I mean, it's really hard to get rid of authoritarians. When they get in power, it's really hard to get rid of them, and usually elections will not allow us to take care of that. Joel, what do we do if the blue seats last night were just a reflection of the cockroaches returning to the shadows? We turn a light on and take a drink. So that's a good question. Okay, so actually, there's another question I saw. Yeah, okay, so the next question is Kpop and Zoomers 2020 activists. And a lot of people have been asking me today what I think happened last night. On one hand, I think it's about the fact that the Trump campaign doesn't have momentum, and that Trump is, just a really terrible candidate who has no argument whatsoever to be reelected, other than cultural rage. I think his supporters, even though they're the ones who are going to be out there with like pandemic, poster boards and signs talking about Bill Gates vaccines, they're even afraid to go out and go to this rally. And on top of that, why would you want to go and hang out with a loser like Trump, especially at a time where he's losing left and right? It's a sad scene. And maybe you have cultural rage, and maybe you want to go out and yell and get some of your frustration out. But they like Trump whenever he felt like a conquering hero. The fact that he's losing, he just feels sad. I think with the K-pop and the Zoomers, particularly, and for those who aren't familiar, there's a lot of stories out right now about K-pop fans and younger people who used, the internet to take out a bunch of tickets to the rally. I don't think they necessarily kept people from coming, but I think what they exposed is that the Trump campaign is like wildly inept and incompetent and impotent. I mean, Parscale is one of the worst campaign managers I've ever seen. And one thing that you'll notice about him, which is actually different from what other campaign managers do, anyone who's ever worked on a campaign or been at the front of a campaign, what you do is you lower expectations. You tell people, yeah, we think we'll have a good turnout. We'll see what happens. The coronavirus is out there. It's hot outside. Who knows what'll happen? And then if more people show up, then you tell people, like, you win. You actually win something that you're winning anyway. Parscale has just been bragging about the campaign as if it's like, he keeps calling it a Death Star. That's not how you campaign. Like, you don't go out acting like you're a juggernaut. You come in very, very meekly, and then you become a juggernaut, and that's the way you build momentum in the arc of your story. He's really terrible, and the Trump campaign's always been terrible. It just so happened in 2016 that Trump, caught lightning and also had, I don't know, interference from foreign nationals. So, are the cockroaches scurrying when the light comes on? Possibly. And, are internet activists, playing a part in this? Absolutely they are. But Trump is losing his fastball, man. He's losing basically the entire weird base that he constructed. I mean, rich people have been losing their money in the economy outside the people who have all their money in the stock market, which is inhuman and gross. You have business owners who haven't been able to open their business because he screwed up coronavirus. And then you have the white nationalists who are pissed off because he isn't actually going to build the wall. And he's also become an interventionalist, which they voted for him not to be. So he's actually losing a big chunk of his base. Now, whether or not that means that he'll still get the same amount of people who show up to vote for him, maybe. But I mean, this thing is, it's a really wounded, awful campaign right now. TJS, on Trumpcast this week, you talked about Bill Barr and fascist Christians. What do these people want, and what are their goals? All right, so I was on Trumpcast talking about esoteric, occultism, and Bill Barr, who just showed his ass this week. I mean, this whole thing with the, saying that he didn't fire a guy, that he was stepping down, and it turns out that he completely lied. Stephanie, I see your question. I'll answer that in a second. Bill Barr isn't actually about the rule of law. The Attorney General is, supposed to be the guardian of the rule of law in America. He's not. He's a dominionist. He's a person who believes that the only way that America can be saved and the world can be saved is if a, white Christian theocratic ethno-state is created, and then Christianity uses America as a launching pad to take over the rest of the world. I mean, we're talking about crusader shit. We're talking about like going to other countries and, forcibly making them convert. I mean, this is it's the Crusades and fascism. And, what they want is eventually, and it's one of two things. You go around the world for the Crusades and you create a Christian ethno-state that can, become heaven on earth, or you create an apocalyptic scenario where Christ can return and reign over the earth. This is stuff, unfortunately, I grew up in. Whenever I write about the cult of the Shining City, this is what I'm talking about, which is this really bizarre, dangerous American white identity, neo-Confederate, evangelical, cult, where you're taught that America is under attack by Satan and evil forces, which always ends up becoming like Jewish people because it's all an anti-Semitic bullshit conspiracy theory. And you are taught that you have to take over the world. And that's what Bill Barr is about. That's how he operates. That's how him and Pompeo and Mike Pence, that's how they see the world. And here's the thing, like, we're not actually talking even just about religion at that point. We're talking about radicalized religion, right? People can have faiths, but these are people who bring their faiths into an aggressive apocalyptic stance. I had people in my circle, friends, family, who went over and fought in Iraq, which was a completely illegal war that was fought under false pretenses, but also to further an American crusade. We shouldn't have to suffer through that. Our politics shouldn't be riddled through with cultists who are trying to hasten the end of the world and are looking for any opportunity for World War III or whatever they're going to call it. But that's what they want. They want either a Christian white ethno-state, or they want the end of the world, at which point they go to heaven. And, there's a lot of this, like, Middle Ages, medieval times stuff involved. They want to turn the clock back. They want to get rid of human rights. They want to get rid of democracy and progress. And if you read their writings, that's all they talk about. They talk about how equality and democracy are the most damning things possible, and we need a strict hierarchical class, basically, for white men to rule over the rest of the world. Now, there is a side question with this that I want to answer, which goes along with it. It says, do you agree or disagree that monotheistic cults are fascistic? So, fun thing, I actually am almost done on a new book proposal right now. that I'm really excited about, getting out there and shopping and doing the research for. And you know, it sort of rung true with me, and I think it did for a lot of evangelicals who escaped the cult of the Shining City. It became really clear to me the day that Trump sort of walked through the violence of the protest that he created, and stood in front of the church and held up the Bible and said, "I'm the president of law and order." And there's a thing that's happening there, and I started going through history, and I started observing fascism. I started from where we are and I moved backwards, and what I started to notice is that the through line from modern times back to like the middle of the Roman Empire into the fall of the Roman Empire is this weaponized Christianity. And so, for those who aren't aware of the history of Christianity, it started out as a sect, of course, that followed Jesus Christ and was based on martyrdom and suffering and social justice. And the Roman Empire and other people persecuted them, tortured them, killed them, put them through literal hell. But then in, I believe it's 312 AD, Emperor Constantine declares that he sees a vision from God, and God commands him to go out and conquer. And so what happens is Constantine becomes a religious dictator, and then throughout the rest of human history, fascism is always underpinned by a weaponized, aggressive Christianity that is also still paranoid and fearful of persecution and violence, but is doling it out on other people. In the Crusades, the Inquisition, you even get up to like, oh my God, it's like the British Empire. You look at Spain, how all of these colonies are treated, how native people are treated and destroyed, and genocides carried out, and slavery, imposed. It's all this weird sect of aggressive Christianity. So here's the point that I'm trying to make. Monotheistic religion, I think, can live in a free and open society when its purpose isn't conquering. And that's one of the big differences. I think that like everyone just sort of says religion, and it's just like everybody can, worship the way they want, which obviously is how a pluralistic, open society should work. The problem happens whenever a religion believes that it has to go out and either convert people by choice or force them to under the threat of violence and death and genocide. So that was why I was really happy that you asked that question. I'm really hard at work on this book proposal, and I don't want to say I'm excited because it sounds terrible that I'm excited about writing a history of fascism and how religion has been used to do that. But I'm excited about the project. So thank you for asking that question. Some say there are white supremacist elements that want to ignite a race war or a civil war in America. To what result? How do they see that ending? There are absolutely groups of white supremacists in this country who are interested in creating a race war or a new civil war. I won't get in particulars because I don't necessarily want to talk about where I first heard this kind of stuff. Turning on the light. Since I was a kid, I was told by people in the church and people around me that, there was a race war that was imminent. It was always going to happen. And I think in part, a lot of that was driven by like the social unrest and the riots in LA in 92. And I think, race was a really raw wound at that time. And so you saw a lot of people who maybe they had fascistic beliefs, but they weren't very open about them and vocal about them, start to really hold on to those fascistic beliefs and really start to espouse them. So yeah, there's been talk for a very long time about a race war or a civil war happening in America. And what you need to understand, and by the way, I'm doing a lot of these conversations to talk about my new book, American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. When I was doing research on that, I had to get really deep into neo-Nazi culture and neo-Nazism and white supremacy culture and theory. I was reading stuff like, the Turner Diaries and William Pierce's stuff and Siege and all that stuff. These groups don't all agree on everything. Like some of them, like for instance, one of the most misunderstood groups right now is like the Boogaloo Boys, who weirdly enough are different from like other white supremacist groups or other groups looking for a race war because they like don't respect authority and they actually have problems with the cops and law enforcement. And then there are other groups that are like, well, we want white law enforcement to take over. We want a police state. But what has basically happened is, and this goes back to what I was saying, America has failed in a lot of different ways, and it's in the process of converting into a failed state. It can't really take care of the will of the people. It's not interested in it anymore. It can't solve even basic problems because even our smallest problems have knotted together with other problems and gotten worse and worse and worse until you can't even start approaching them. So America is sort of like a disappointing state marching towards a failed state. You have a lot of people who would rather just accelerate things and, bring it to some sort of apocalyptic conclusion so they can burn it down and then start something new. The neo-Nazis want this. The neo-fascists want this. Traditionalists like Steve Bannon want this. I mean, there is a lot of this stuff that is all about breaking us down and then leading us to a place where it's like a sandbox. It's like you build a big giant castle, you get tired of the castle, so you squash the castle, try and build a new one. So that's what they want. They want a civil war so that they can take over, they can destroy democracy and open society and a pluralist society, and that they can come to power. All of these fantasies, and this is one of the reasons why all these people, collect guns and are preppers and all this stuff. They believe that like a cleansing, like an apocalypse, like if we get into a new dark ages, and most of them actually want to return to the dark ages, which I don't know about you, I enjoy longer lifespans and knowledge and open society, but they want that, right? They want to get back to this point where they can start over. And after they start over, they can create a society that's based on their own whims without having to deal with everyone else. And again, that's fascism, right? They want to get rid of anyone who disagrees with them so they don't have to worry about democracy, equality, liberty, pluralism, all that stuff. So their end goal is literally the destruction of society, wiping the slate clean so they can come in and create their new society and not have to deal with elections and appointments and all the things that we're dealing with now. Juxtapose asks, do I have thoughts on 2024 GOP potentials? I've heard Cotton, Howley, Haley, Pence, Don Jr., and how their politics fit into all of this. So I'm going to take a drink, and then I'm going to tell you the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the Republican nominee for president in 2024 is Donald Trump. If he wins re-election or steals re-election, I don't believe for a second that he's going to leave after 2 terms. If he lives through 2 terms, there's no way he's not going to run again. They have historical precedent, that this is a thing that happened after FDR. They'll roll it back or try and roll it back. And, I could definitely see Donald Trump running for a 3rd term in 2024 or, not even running for anything and not really having an election. They're absolutely grooming Donald Trump Jr. for a political future. I could see him in 2024 running for something like the governor of New York. I could see him, going to Florida and running for the Senate there, some kind of weird batshit thing. And by the way, it's Father's Day, so let's talk about how pathetic Donald Trump Jr. is. My God, it's so sad. And what you've actually seen is the sadness and the patheticness and the brokenness of Donald Trump leading to the sadness and brokenness and patheticness of Donald Trump Jr. The same way that I'm sure that Trump's dad, Fred Christ Trump, which is weird that his middle name is Christ, put down on his kid. So yeah, Trump Jr. is just a sad, sad case, but he'll run for something unless, he gets arrested for one of the many laws that he's broken. Tom Cotton's an absolute possibility. Mike Pence is a possibility. What I would guess right now, if I had to, is that if you were thinking about Trumpism or Republicanism as something that sort of shifts and moves and like a digit goes here and a digit goes there, I would guess the next iteration of it would be heavier on white identity evangelicalism and or, aggressive chicken hawk policies, intervention around the world, crusades. A little bit less on the Trump part and a little bit more veiled appeals to racism, because I think Donald Trump gets away with that because he's shameless. Other people are a little more afraid to do it than he is. So yeah, I could see a debate stage. If we're out in public again, who knows what's going to happen with this pandemic? I could see Cotton, Haley, and Pence on a stage together while Donald Trump runs for something. And by the way, real fast, you know what? Screw it. We're talking about it. The Republican Party needs to go away. Like parties, go away. They reach a terminal point of like an illness where they don't actually represent people anymore. And the Republican Party has nothing to do with politics anymore. It's just a fascistic white identity movement. It needs to go away. And my God, do I wish that people like, the Never Trumpers or the Project Lincoln people or whatever's left of the neocons, whatever, just go form a new party and, like try and build something there, lose a few cycles, build up a party from the ground up, start trying to find anybody who isn't a complete, total racist fascist and put together something different because this party's done. I don't care if you want to call it the Lincoln Party, call it that, whatever, the Abe Party, I don't care. Just go. Just go and form something new. The Republican Party's done. Or it should be. CM asked if I saw the Tennessee newspaper insert about biblical prophecies, Trump and a major attack. Absolutely, I did. My little Cult of the Shining City antenna went up on that one. For those who haven't seen it, you should go look. There was just this insert that like a crazy person paid to put in the paper. But this goes back to politics, national culture, national storylines, but also the narrative of religion. It activates people who are unwell. And it leads to them making connections that aren't there because they're looking for whatever sort of like catch-all conspiracy that explains everything. And you end up doing like QAnon bullshit where all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a secret plan. And did you see the other day that Taylor Swift dropped a new album? Obviously, the secret indictments are getting ready to be revealed. It's just like, what are we doing here? And it's sort of this haven for unwell people. And the Republican Party, white identity, evangelicalism, apocalypticism, like it's all the bastion for these people. I mean, that's why, you had a Trump supporter, last October sending bombs to Democrat leaders because they believe this big trumped up bullshit narrative that they're fighting like some sort of an evil war against a, invisible cabal. Which, by the way, a quick little aside, I've talked about this a lot on the Muckrake podcast. I know that a lot of people aren't interested in like learning about QAnon and they don't want to know exactly what's happening there because it's laughable and absolutely ridiculous. You got to pay attention to this stuff. What you end up seeing there is like the pure, unadulterated, undiluted craziness at the heart of Trumpism. And these are the people, and we can laugh at them all you want and laugh at their ridiculous narratives. These are the people who like have already killed people. These are like the radicalized people of the future who are going to like do real damage. So you absolutely need to pay attention to them. My old man, rest in peace, used to tell me something. And he said, if you're in a bar and a dude walks in and that dude is dangerous, you pay attention to that dangerous dude. You don't turn your back on him. You keep an eye on him and figure out what he's doing. That's what this is about. You got to keep track of like the most dangerous elements of this movement because they're not just dangerous, like they're murderous. They've killed people already. They've talked about killing more people. You got to keep an eye on these people. Andrew says, oh, here we go. How do we deal with fascism legally with eyes open to danger, especially if reform happens? In other words, how do you respond and contain fascistic elements without replicating fascism? Denouncing is asymptomatic to the threat, criminalizing constitutionally problematic, monitoring too passive. Okay, let's have a talk. One of the things that nobody wants to really talk about in this country is that fascism is something that has been a part of America since its very beginning. Donald Trump brought it to the forefront and, made it very clear that we have people in this country who have been fascist for a long time. We've had all kinds of fascist movements. We had a Nazi movement in this country for a very long time. It gained a lot of power and purchase. Before that, we had people battling in the streets and beating union workers. I mean, we had, obviously, we had people out there lynching black people. We had the Ku Klux Klan. Before that, we had roving bands of vigilantes. I mean, the way that this country dealt with its founding and people who weren't being served by the government, they were radical. They were really, really dangerous and fascist. Some of the people from history were fascist. John Adams was a fascist president. Alexander Hamilton was incredibly fascist when putting together our economy and the way that our society worked. So these are things that have always been there. The problem right now is multi. So on one hand, we have the laws to take care of this stuff. Like you see supremacist groups all the time, terrorist groups, and you hear about them. Maybe they get busted, maybe they don't. A lot of them operate in public. Like the idea that a paramilitary group could go into the Michigan state capitol and like shut down the entire legislature, like that was allowed to happen. Those people went in there with the express purpose of intimidating politicians and shutting down government. You have the laws to deal with this. Our law enforcement groups know that white terrorism and white fascism are the biggest threats. You see it in reports one after another. The problem is that the rest of Americans don't want to deal with it because to deal with white terrorism means you have to deal with white supremacy. So, one of the things I'm really hopeful about right now is that this current movement is starting to illuminate white supremacy. You're seeing scores and scores of people who are starting to understand systemic prejudice and racism. That's a good start. That's a great start in dealing with fascism. But here's the other problem: our media, our journalists, they treat fascism as if it's a normal opinion. Donald Trump won the presidency in part because they treated him like he was a normal person saying normal things. They put mics in front of his supporters. They brought, politicians in the Republican Party on their programs, let them lie openly and honestly. They didn't fight it. We have to change the way that we see it. And because here's the thing, we're not going to defeat fascism by putting together roving bands of armies that go door to door and give somebody a Blade Runner like fascist test. It doesn't work. And it never works. Like that would even descend into its own type of fascism that we can't even get into. We have the laws, but what we need to change is the way that society works. We have to change what we value and what we put forward. The media can't go around like giving these people platforms. This is one of the reasons why I was both so pissed off by Tom Cotton's editorial in the New York Times, but also like really relieved by it because it brought out an opinion that a lot of wealthy and elite people, powerful people had, and also exposed the fact that they're willing to talk about straight fascistic ideals. That has to stop. We have to move towards, again, a pluralist, open society. We have to change the way we talk about politics, and in a really big way, and we'll talk about this more in a second, we have to change the way we talk about history. We have to recognize fascism without saying that word shuts down everything and suddenly that you can't have a conversation anymore, right? It has to be a thing where we recognize fascism, we diagnose it, and we work against it. And I'll tell you something real fast, and I'm sure I'm going to repeat myself in a minute. The moment that our educational system starts reflecting like actual reality and it starts reflecting actual history, people who recognize fascism is a regular component of America will start to see it in themselves. These people don't believe they're fascists. They believe they're patriots. They believe they're realists. The people in my family, the people I've known who are fascist, believe that they're patriots. They think they're just telling it like it is, right? And they're saying it in a way that like other people are afraid to say. They're being fascistic. And if they knew what fascism was, and they knew that fascism was something that could happen in America instead of it was something that was isolated 20th century, Europe, that would make a huge difference. God, I just saw as I'm looking for the next thing, I saw Country 38 say she got yelled at. That's terrible. God, what an awful time this is. Actually, the next question actually is from Murray, who asked me, what do I make of the African American men who've been found hanging lately? I haven't talked about this a lot because I'm waiting on facts to come in. It's really sketchy. There's a lot of black men who've just been found hanging, and it was instantly called suicide. I don't turn the light up one more time. I don't believe that, but I'm waiting. I try really, really hard to represent news that I've either fact checked or people I trust to fact check. So I don't want to push misinformation. I don't want to jump on these things too quickly. But this is what happens in America. You have epidemics like this of lynching and discrimination and hate crimes. It's really terrible. I remember, God, I want to say it was in 2016. It was before most people had seen my reporting. There was after the Dylan Roof thing in Charleston. There was a epidemic of people burning down black churches, and I drove around the southern part of the country, going to these burnt churches, and it was obvious that this was a matter of white supremacist intimidation. And everybody who talked about it, they kept calling them isolated incidents. They didn't want to talk about it as if it was some sort of systemic problem, but it obviously was. Yeah, it's really sad. And I'm really worried about these lynchings that are happening, and what it means. It's really really awful. Heather asked me, "What are my politics? I go after Republicans constantly, and I've heard you on the Muckrake podcast called Democrats to Task. What do you believe?" So I can't get into the totality of my politics, but I'll start here. Um, I think right now in America, the only party that you can ethically or morally vote for is the Democratic Party. It's the only party that is based in a reality that even comes close to resembling the reality that we all live in. I think the Republican Party is not only a fascistic movement at this point, but it is completely insulated, lost, and drowning in an alternate paranoid conspiracy theory riddled reality that is constructed for exploitation and also radicalization. So right now, I say this all the time. I will go into the voting booth and break my hand voting for a Democrat right now in order to restore sanity. But one of the things that gets me a lot of heat, particularly on my podcast and in my writing and in my analysis, is I don't believe in the what I would call messianization of people and figures. I don't think anyone is all good or all bad. I don't buy into the idea that an entire political party is perfect. I think the Democratic Party has a lot of problems. I think the Democratic Party, in a lot of different ways, has done a poor job of representing its voters, who I think have the best intentions possible, but I don't always appreciate the way that they've handled it since the 1990s. And this was from research I did for American Rule. They intentionally moved rightward and embraced Reaganism, which I think is a real problem. So yeah, I am neither, but what I would say is that I like to approach each situation and examine it on its merits. I like to say that I can have an open mind, but right now we live in a time where you can't have an open mind when it comes between Democrats and Republicans. I think I think that's impossible right now. And I think in truth, what you're actually seeing is you're seeing, and by the way, in the corner, I'm seeing my little cat running around. So there's that. I think that you have to, again, take them on their merits, understand them, and consider them as they come. So that's my politics. I believe in humanity, by the way, if I just want to throw another thesis out there. I believe that we should be working towards a better society, a more fair society, a more human society. I think we should be able to take care of each other. If you want to do some reading and understand what I believe, go and look at the Second Bill of Rights that Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked about. I think we should have a better, more human society. What are my thoughts on local school boards and history instruction in the United States? I think it isn't great. I think our history has been smoothed out and weaponized and propagandized. A lot of that, and I've talked about this on Twitter, so if you're interested in it, go and check it out. I think it's been weaponized to hide white supremacy and continue keeping people of power and wealth in power. We don't study history. We study a story. I was talking with a buddy of mine earlier today, and it's like one of those things where, you kind of get told it's like, oh, America is about freedom, and that's how we started. And then the next thing you know, you're talking about the Civil War, and oh, that solved racism. And then all of a sudden you're at World War II, and that's all. It's just this survey. And we don't actually get taught why these things happen, how they happen. And the next question I have is actually someone asking me what surprised me writing my book, American Rule, which is a retelling of American history. It surprised me, as much as I've read about, as many classes as I've taken and educated myself on history, it surprised me how much I didn't actually know and how much had been hidden from me in my education. And there's a ton of experts out there who, have written books, they've written scholarship on this stuff, but they've been walled away from you in the war on education. And they've gone out and they have, basically told you not to pay attention to professors and academics. They write to each other, but it's not out there for a lot of public consumption. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, American Rule, is like the stuff that I found out, everything from the fact that, the Constitutional Convention didn't have authority to do a new constitution. I learned the truth about, the genocide of Native Americans, all of that stuff. Like, and actually, like, the fact that we, brought in Nazis after World War II, and it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. We're not taught that. And real fast, I saw from on here, Craig says, at what age should these histories be taught? I've been having this conversation a lot with historians and people I know. I'm not sure, but we have to stop the mythologization of like founding fathers. We got to stop talking about George Washington as if he was perfect and Abraham Lincoln as if he was a messiah. And actually, the next question is, why do I hate Abraham Lincoln? And I don't. I actually think Abraham Lincoln is a hero of American history. But the fact that we've turned him into a messiah is insane. I mean, I wrote about this and people fought back against it. Abraham Lincoln like spoke openly about white supremacy, and when he talked about the Civil War, he said he was more than willing to save the Union without freeing slaves. He tried to sell free slaves to England to move them to Honduras. He told freed slaves left and right he didn't believe they were equal to white people. Does that mean that the Emancipation Proclamation isn't an amazing moment in American history? No, it doesn't. Does that mean that Lincoln isn't a hero? Absolutely he is. He saved the Union. But we have to look at humans as they're humans. And if you're going to look at people like Washington and Jefferson as humans, you have to look at Lincoln too. He's not perfect. He wasn't infallible. He wasn't Christ. And unfortunately, what happened post Civil War is people intentionally turned Abraham Lincoln into a Christ like figure. And as a result, you can't have a conversation about who he was and how he evolved, which shows us an actual very, very complicated history of America. So we have to start by not mythologizing these people because they were people. They had faults and they had a lot of hypocrisies. All right. Real fast. Aquamarine says, I'm struck by the rebellion complex of all these boomers and Xers who are conservative now. That's absolutely true. And one of the biggest rhetorical tricks that they've actually done, the radicalized right, is that they've started to tell everyone that they're the true rebels, right? They're willing to trouble political correctness. And it's just straight bullshit. It's like this weird heroization that they've done of themselves. It's really bizarre. And in fact, all they are, they're a bunch of bootlickers. That's all they are. They're a bunch of like neo-fascists who all believe in like, you know, standing up with Donald Trump and saluting him like a god emperor. It is hot out here. Georgia is swampy, people. All right, next up, we have 2 questions left. What do I think of Jeff Sessions praising Trump for having hit the right notes in Tulsa? I think Jeff Sessions is pathetic. I mean, you want to talk about bootlickers. This is a person that Trump has just kicked in the ribs like a dog for years now. And Jeff Sessions just keeps coming back and licking the leather on Trump's boot. Jeff Sessions is pathetic. And I will say, going back to the idea of white supremacy and its patheticness and its fragility, look at Beauregard Sessions, man. Like, what a pathetic toad of a person that is. And he exemplifies this whole thing. It's the same thing with like Lindsey Graham. I mean, they're just people who, they're just really gross and sad, pathetic people. And they have been waiting on someone like Trump to come in and just, you know, whip them into shape and be their, you know, authoritarian for years. So that's what I think. I think Sessions is pathetic. And I think one of the reasons why you've seen Jeff Sessions be such a white supremacist and be so racist is because he's so pathetic himself, which is what defines white supremacy in itself, is a really pathetic white paranoia and fear. They're just really pitiable people. Okay, last question from Lucy. Assuming Trump loses in November, what laws are needed to prevent another fascist wreaking further devastation on U.S. democratic institutions? Actually, I had one more, I guess, that dovetailed in this and says, if I could make one change, what would it be? The one change I would make in America if I just had like absolute power, and by God, having absolute power is a terrible thing, so I would never actually want it. But if I could just change something, like move a little dial, it would probably be campaign finance reform. One of the problems is that only rich, wealthy, powerful people can run for office. Those of you who may not know this, but I thought about running for Congress back in 2016, and I actually I got a lot of interest into it, and I started looking into it. And what I found out was that it was more about fundraising than it was leading or putting forth new ideas. And, you know, I would basically have to raise like nearly $1 million. It's really terrible. So all this stuff that infects our elections, it makes it to where like only the rich and powerful and people who are bought and sold by, you know, lobbyists and special interests can do this. I think that has diluted our representative pool. I think it's taken a lot of really good people who maybe don't have money or the connections and kept them from a life of service. I think it was disgusting. And I think it's always been disgusting. And I think that we should run on a system where like, if you win your party's primary, you get a certain amount of money. And I actually think that it's like antithetical to like the presidential campaign is actually antithetical to what the presidency should be about. Because if you actually look at like a presidential campaign, like it's not about raising money. Like that's not actually what a presidency is about. The president shouldn't have to raise money. It's about directing resources. It's about, organizing people. So it'd be better if they got like a pot of money, and they had to direct those finances and show that they could organize. By the same notion, like one of the things a president should be able to do is to rally the nation and get a message out there and really get people together around it. Like, give them, I don't know, 2 to 3 hours of free time on TV where they can do whatever they want, a commercial, an infomercial, a town hall, whatever. But like, get rid of all this bullshit with raising all this money. It's infected and just absolutely diluted the talent pool. This is one of the reasons why somebody like, AOC is like a revelation. The fact that she was able to get into Congress is like a slight miracle. And it's just because she has like a supernatural talent at this thing. There are tons of really talented people who aren't involved in politics, and it's because of money. Laws, I'll throw this out there, and this is something people haven't wanted to talk about for a long time. We do this thing where when we have power, we want power. When the other group has power, we don't want them to have power. One of the biggest problems in America has been the overexpansion of the executive branch. It was never meant to be the all-encompassing, end-all, be-all. Over the years, whether it was the W. Bush administration or, all the executive orders that have happened in modern times, we've expanded it in terms of its power and role. And we really need to rein in the presidency. There's no reason. And Donald Trump makes that clear. Before Donald Trump, everybody's like, well, whatever, happens with these people, we'll get somebody competent there, right? Whoever ends up with the keys to the, nuclear arsenal or ends up in the Oval Office will be competent. Well, they're not. Donald Trump got there. So yeah, I think the executive branch needs to be reined in, and I think that'll lead to some changes. And if we got rid of out there raising money and having to lick boots of special interest, I think that'd make a big change. All right, so into this thing. Thanks for hanging out for another hour on a Sunday. I truly, truly enjoy these things. Cheers to all the victories. Cheers to all future victories. I'll be back, hopefully, if everything goes well. I'll be back next week. We'll be taping a new Muckrake podcast for Tuesday. If you haven't already, please go out, pre-order American Rule, How Nation Conquered the World But Failed Its People. Real fast, just to be, straight up honest and earnest, I really appreciate you people. It's awesome. I have to tell you, from the work that I'm doing on Twitter and the research that I've been doing, it's just really nice to have people out there to talk to and people who are supportive and kind. And it just means a lot to me. This is the best way to spend a Sunday night that I think I've found in a long, long time. So thank you, everyone. Cheers. Be safe. I'll see you later.